welcome back, gentlemen and ladies. Another fine edition of the extension of the HIAC Talk Radio Wrestling Podcast. My name is Craig Lagans, and joining me this week will be our regular co-host, Dan Law, 83, Dan Calachico, and joining us for the first time, and hopefully not the last time, Chris Kazama. He of the Fight Club with the one in it. I'm going to take these gentlemen back to a time when wrestling was available in all 50 states, when titles were called belts, and when organizations and territories respected one another and worked with each other to promote the best possible product they could, back when sports entertainment was indeed professional wrestling. This week in wrestling history, some historic things happened. And thank God I'm calling this segment The Wrestling Historian, because some historic things happened.
Yeah.
We're going to go back to December 10th, 1972, Kansas City, Kansas. George Scrap Iron Gadaski went to a 10-minute draw with a young man making his professional wrestling debut. So on December 10th, 1972, George Scrap Iron Gadaski went to a 10-minute draw with some guy calling himself the Nature Boy, Ric Flair.
I knew there was a hook to this.
The very Ric Flair we're talking about in a previous edition of HIAC Talk Radio, talking about the age of Ric Flair and how that was his gimmick. Well, he made his pro wrestling debut December 10th, 1972. And the rest, as we know, is history. Slightly. And Ric Flair wrestled on that very date, on his very birthday, all the way up until 2012, I believe. So almost 50 years of wrestling. It started on that day, December 10th, 1972. Exactly 3 years later, on that same day, December 10th, 1975, the NWA heavyweight champion Jack Briscoe defended his NWA title in Miami Beach, Florida. Unfortunately, that would be the last time that Jack Briscoe would hold the NWA title, because he would lose it that day to Terry Funk.
Huh.
And Terry Funk would win his first and only World Heavyweight Championship on December 10th, 1975. Now, Terry would hold that belt for about 15 months, but Terry Funk's reputation was made, because everywhere Terry Funk went after that, and as long as he wrestled well into the 2000s, where it was NWA, WWF, ECW, Terry Funk made his mark, but he was always referred to as a former world champion. But Terry Funk only held the NWA title one time, and one time only, and it happened December 10th, 1975.
As much as the list of legends that were never champion is fascinating, him being only in the one-time club is extremely mind-boggling to me, even to these years later, considering how many times that dude reinvented himself, air quotes, because he just was nuts. It baffles me he's a one-time champion. It's Terry goddamn Funk, and a one-time champion just never – it's so weird to say to me. It's just weird as saying Roddy Piper was never world title. What?
Yeah, and same with Dory. Dory Funk Jr. was, for many, the standard of wrestling in the late 60s, early 70s, right after Lou Thesz. Dory Funk Jr. kind of picked up that mantle as being the one and perfect wrestling machine as NWA champion, and he held the title longer than anyone in a generation. Held it for 4 years, but Dory Funk Jr. was only a one-time champion.
It's insane to me.
It is insane. One of the teams we were just talking about, one of the people we lost one half of the greatest tag team of all time, the Road Warriors. The Road Warriors put the NWA on its back, and they were the best tag team in the NWA, but were only NWA tag team champions once.
That's, yeah, okay. That doesn't make sense.
Crazy.
Yeah. Had every other title, but only the standard bearer in the NWA tag team, but Only held it once. Speaking of first, December 13th, and sorry, I have to put on the glasses now because I'm getting old. I'm
I
talking
don't
about
know what you're
glasses.
talking about. I don't wear glasses.
I
I
have to
don't
go
know your
back in
problem.
history. December 13th, 1971. This is going to be a callback segment. The Japanese Wrestling Association, the JWA, as it were, fired one of its premier wrestlers because this wrestler was trying to stage a coup, trying to take over the company. So the JWA, the Japanese Wrestling Association, fired Antonio Inoki. Uh,
Oops.
Antonio Inoki would later go on to found New Japan Pro Wrestling. That same year, another of their top wrestlers in the JWA, Giant Baba, would also leave the Japanese Wrestling Association. And Baba would form the All Japan Wrestling Association that same year. And as coincidentally, the JWA lost Antonio Inoki and Giant Baba on December 13th, 1971, the JWA closed in 1973.
Really?
And yeah, but yet both New Japan Pro Wrestling, headed by Antonio Inoki, and All Japan Pro Wrestling, headed by Giant Baba, still exist. But
It's crazy to me that Anoki waited because if I'm not mistaken, it's like July of 1972 that Anoki founded New Japan. So he waited like 6 months, 7 months after leaving, after trying to stage this coup. Was like, you know what? I'm just gonna go make my own promotion, and I'm gonna make sure that people know that this is in 1972 because we're gonna make sure it's branded on everything till the end of time.
yeah, and I think what had happened was, Chris, is that Inoki was talking to the head of, and he's like, I got this idea for we can still call it JWA, but if we do it this way, we bring in some American wrestlers and do it like that. And the owner, the booker at the time, just said no. So Inoki just did what he was going to do anyway, but he wanted to do it in JWA, and he was ousted because of that. Um, so it's kind of like, well, if you listen to me, you'd still be in business.
In the chat, so Anoki sat on that for months just steaming.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm gonna get him. That son of a bitch.
Those motherfuckers.
And Dan, that might have been whoever the head of the Japanese Wrestling Association then might have been the Japanese Vern Gagne, because had he just like listened to a guy that knows what the hell he's talking about,
Yeah.
he might still have been in business.
I was gonna say it's like very good. It was like, just get out of here. Oops.
Why don't you put the belt on Hogan, Vern? He's outselling every wrestler in North America, and he's got this great movie, Rocky III, that's #1 at the box office, and you have him here in your league. Why not put the belt on him? It's okay. I know what the hell I'm doing.
Oops.
Whoops. Speaking of the AWA, I'm staying on that date,
Okay.
December 13th, 1988. The AWA decided they were lagging behind, so why don't they get on the act of doing this pay-per-view thing? Since the WWF and the NWA were doing it, the AWA decided to have their very first pay-per-view. So they called in everyone. So it wasn't just the AWA. They called in World Class, Memphis, Japan, the LWA, the LPWA, Ladies Professional Wrestling World Association, all of them to be on this big pay-per-view called Super Clash 3. And that would be the AWA's initial foray into pay-per-view. And for a lot of people, it was their first pay-per-view ever. It was Cactus Jack's first pay-per-view ever.
Oh wow, I didn't know that's where he debuted.
That was his first pay-per-view.
Wow.
He was wrestling for Memphis at the time. Actually, he was wrestling between Memphis and World Class, but that was his first pay-per-view. Quirky little match there. Greg Gagne won the AWA television title from Ronnie Garvin. And it was weird because Ronnie Garvin had already signed with the WWF, but didn't want to do a job for Greg Gagne on his way out. So
He's got to be like that.
Yeah. So they had it. He lost the belt in a countout, to Greg Gagne. So that's the way they worked their way around that. Of course, the main event was the AWA heavyweight champion, Jerry Lawler, going up against the world-class heavyweight champion, Kerry Von Erich, and a unified world title bout that had to be a winner. And they had to work their way around that because Kerry was going to do a blade job in this match with Jerry to get some juice. The thing is about Kerry, he got a little careless with the blade because if anyone has known Kerry for any amount of time, and Jerry Lawler and both Ric Flair said the same thing about Kerry. They both wrestled Kerry Von Erich more than any two wrestlers ever. But both guys loved Kerry, great guy, but always impaired. So Kerry, in whatever state he was in before the match, with the blade that he had taped to his wrist, had sliced open his bicep. This was in the dressing room before the bout, before anything. So he was already bleeding a gusher. So to start the bout, Jerry had to attack him before the bell and slam his arm into the post to get the blood that was already gushing out of his arm and his biceps. And then when Kerry did actually blade himself during the match, went way too deep. And the finish of the match was Kerry had the iron claw on Jerry Lawler, whose shoulders were down for longer than 3 seconds, but the referee looked at the face of Kerry Von Erich and rang the bell and declared that Kerry Von Erich was in no shape to continue. So Jerry Lawler was awarded the unified heavyweight championship, the AWA and the world class title, even though his shoulders were down, but Kerry Von Erich had been bleeding too much, and the referee called the bout. He and Jerry Jarrett later on that year would buy World Class, and effectively putting World Class out of business. And Jerry Lawler would keep the unified title, and as being the only man to hold the AWA and the World Class Heavyweight Championship. That bout was held in Chicago, the UIC Pavilion, the same place that the NWA had held Starrcade, and the same place that the WWF had held WrestleMania 2. But on this particular AWA bout, they only drew 1,672 fans to that same arena, and that would be the last pay-per-view in the history of the AWA. So the AWA Super Clash would be the first, last, and only AWA pay-per-view ever.
Batting 1,000, 1 for 1.
Yeah.
Could you imagine if that finish happened this year? Like, how fans would react if someone has a submission and the other person is down for 2 seconds and the referee looks at the other person and is like, hey, he's bleeding too much, this is over. Could you imagine how Twitter would act on that finish right now?
It was amazing, and it was great booking because it saved both guys, because Jerry Lawler could say, I won, but he was flat on his back, and Kerry could say, well, I had him pinned, but the referee, screwed me out of the decision. It was great booking. Unfortunately, no one saw it, and but it would be great now. But it would be, Twitter. I agree, Chris. Twitter would explode if that kind of booking happened, if that kind of ending happened now, and it's the type of thing that doesn't get booked as much anymore. December 15th, 1963. We touched upon this previously in a previous HIAC Talk Radio episode about wrestling and ratings, and in Japanese wrestling in particular. Well, December 15th, 1963 was the death of a legend in Japanese wrestling, probably the most famous Japanese wrestler of all time. December 15th, 1963 was the death of Rikidōzan.
Oh, yeah.
The father of Puroresu wrestling. Dan, you and I have talked about wrestlers or what would make a good Dark Side of the Ring or a good movie. The story of Rikidōzan is a movie in and of itself because of what this guy did and what this guy accomplished in his short life in professional wrestling. What he did for Japanese wrestling cannot be understated because he pretty much started it all. not only did he train Antonio Inoki and Giant Baba, the two men I mentioned before in this beginning of this segment, who would become the most popular, influential Japanese wrestlers of their generations, but he put Japanese wrestling on a whole nother level. For a guy, especially for someone who was Korean, who was born in Korea. He wasn't Japanese. He moved to Japan later on, but he was the subject of intense racism because of his Korean upbringing, and didn't tell anyone where where he was born. He took on the name. He was born Kim San, but he changed his name to match his Japanese stepfather, to Mitsuhiro Momota. Mitsuhiro Momota
Yes,
was
you're correct.
his Japanese name. But when he started off as a sumo wrestler, and through his connections that he made in sumo wrestling with the Yakuza, with the Japanese mob, he got loans and he got to start his own wrestling organization. It was Japan Pro Wrestling. This was in the late 50s and early 60s. And after World War II, wrestling was the national sport of Japan. And it wasn't until they started bringing American wrestlers over to fight Rikidōzan, and Rikidōzan was beating American wrestlers left and right. Because remember, Americans to Japanese were the villain. So having this man beat these American wrestlers one after the other made Rikidōzan a hero in Japan, and to the point where he was a star of movies, on TV all the time, in gossip magazines. He did more movies than Hulk Hogan ever did in Japan, and was in scene with starlets in Japan, and was a national celebrity. When Rikidōzan would wrestle on TV, they set up screens in parks so people could go and see them, because there wasn't enough TVs in Japan in 1950. And you want to talk about, we talked in the previous episode about ratings, about the ratings that AEW is getting, and AEW and NXT will be getting compared to what TNA was getting in the same time slot. When Rikidōzan wrestled the Destroyer, Dick Beyer, in May of 1963 on Japanese TV, it drew a 67 rating. Not a 6.7, not a 7.6, a 67. That translates into 71 million people watching a wrestling match on Japanese TV.
My eyes closed so hard I couldn't see when I opened them.
Yeah, and that was in '63 when there was more televisions in Japan then. When he wrestled Lou Thesz, Dan, when he wrestled Lou Thesz in 1957, when Rikidōzan wrestled Lou Thesz, that did an 87 rating.
Jesus fucking Christ. Wow. Oh, man.
There is a statue to Rikidōzan still in Japan. Of course, his matter of death, he was partying, he was a drinker. Depending on who you ask, he either stepped on the foot of, or someone from the Yakuza stepped on his foot. A brawl ensued, and Ricky was stabbed in the stomach. He then went to a women's clinic, and he called a gynecologist that he knew, because that's how connected he was. And the woman came out and stitched him up, and he was good to go. But it was told, as long as you don't put anything in your stomach, namely alcohol, Ricky, you'll be fine. Legend has it that Ricky, now that he was fine, went out and continued his drinking and carousing, and a week later he died from internal bleeding. His funeral was attended by the 12,000 people. It was one of the largest funerals for a public figure ever. And like I said, he still has a statue for him. But this was the man that was 5'9" and 240 pounds, okay, who probably wouldn't even make it a 205 lion 205 Live now in today's wrestling. But at 5'9", 240 pounds, Rikidōzan was a giant in Japanese wrestling history and will continue to be so. For what he did as a Japanese wrestler, not only was he the biggest face in Japanese wrestling history, but when he went to America, he was a heel. Because again, just like in America, Japanese wrestlers, Japanese people were seen as bad guys anyway. But thanks to his matches with Lou Thesz, he turned into a face. And Lou Thesz was even gracious enough to trade wins with Rikidōzan in Japan. But Rikidōzan also wore suits when he appeared on TV. And it was Rikidōzan, who was the first cocky heel champion that set the stage for men like Nick Bockwinkel, Ric Flair, the Horseman, to be on TV with a championship belt wearing a suit. Rikidōzan set the bar for that. So his influence, not just in Japanese wrestling, but in American culture, it was Rikidōzan that brought American wrestlers over here for him to beat, that paved the way for wrestlers like Terry Funk, like Stan Hansen, like Bruiser Brody, like Hulk Hogan, like Vader, to make a living in Japan because of Rikidōzan. So we lost December 15th, 1963. We lost a legend. Rikidōzan's name should not be forgotten. He was posthumously awarded a spot in the WWE Hall of Fame, heavy air quotes, in 2017. But any wrestling Hall of Fame has to include Rikidōzan for no other reason, for he was the most influential professional wrestler in any country, United States or Japan, in professional wrestling history.
If you ever need to know how popular or how loved Rikidōzan is, just go to YouTube and type in Rikidōzan Wrestle Kingdom entrance in the video game, where you will see him, the sky will open up and he will descend from heaven into the ring, and that is his entrance while heavenly music plays. It is the most amazing thing you'll ever see in your entire life.
I believe it, Chris.
Oh my God. Yeah, I didn't even know that was a thing.
No.
Yeah, they have him in the game. He's playable. He's almost unbeatable in the game, and he literally descends from heaven as his entrance.
Well, I think that's apropos for a wrestler of Rikidōzan's stature, for what he did for professional wrestling and what he means to professional wrestling. And that, gentlemen and gentlemen, is the wrestling historian.
You do the outros, or you just stare at me?
I'm going to do the outro.
Oh, thank you. I'm so confused. I was like...
And you can find me, Craig Ligons, on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter, CraigLiGeons. Hey, Dan, where can people follow you?
Well, first, before they follow me, I do want to say a second thank you to Chris for joining us this week for both episodes. This one was much quicker than the first one. I try to keep episodes, around an hour, but there is no way I was going to stop that conversation. It was fantastic, and of course, the door is open. You don't need to even kick it open; just push it open with your finger. And next time you want to come in. With that being said, one more time this week, tell everybody where can people follow you and Fight Club.
You can follow me at the Chris Kazama on Instagram and Twitter. You can follow Fight Club at PAWD_WC. That stands for Pan African World Diaspora _Wrestling Championship. You can follow us on YouTube as well. If you are on YouTube, though, Backyard Wrestling Historian thing 2 years ago was my last Backyard Wrestling show that I booked, and that is on YouTube. If you type in NBYWA, A Cold Day in Hell, you will find people who are currently on the independent scene like K.A. Robinson, Christopher Andino, and several others who wrestled in their last Backyard Wrestling shows as well.
Follow me at DanLow83 on Twitter, on Facebook, on Twitch, on YouTube. Type in DanLow83 and you'll find me. You don't have to subscribe, but hit that follow or subscribe button. Well, I meant that. If I subscribe to YouTube, you don't have to subscribe on Twitch because then you pay. So just follow the other way around. No, just kidding. VOCNation.com. On your smartphone, go to your podcast app, type in VOC Nation Radio Network to see all the podcast episodes there. But watch them on Twitch, live here, or on YouTube. And share. Please. Tell everybody. Stop on by. I swear eventually I'll say something funny. I know I'm funny. I made Chris laugh a few times. So you can't lie and say Dan's not funny. It's on record. It's on record now.
Factory.
Exactly. That's it. It's over. The game's up, folks. Can't lie to me now. Subscribe to Stare Creepily, as Matt says, subscribe to Maxim. I'm not on Maxim. We're funny tomorrow. Yes, tomorrow night, on Thursday nights on Twitch, is Game Pass Thursday, where we pick a random game and play it. Most of us playing it for the first time, so join us then. For Craig Legans, for Chris Kazama, I'm Dan Calachico. Farewell and good night.